Well, good morning and welcome back to the Broadcast Retirement Network. I'm Jeff Snyder, and this is BRN Weekly for Saturday, June 6th, 2020. And our top story today, keeping your kids learning during the summer. Well, joining me now to discuss this and a lot more is Abigail Titus. She's a middle school teacher at Pivot Charter School. Abigail, welcome back to the program. Thanks for joining us in the program this morning.
Thanks for having me.
It's great to have you back. And when we last chatted about 2.5 months ago, we talked about COVID-19 and how teachers and students can interact together online. But now that the school year has ended, any reflections from you before we kind of get into some tips?
Yeah, I think I'm still processing like a lot of students and families are in this unprecedented time. And I was lucky to be at a school that was virtual based before this all happened. So the transition was fairly smooth and we were able to service students in a good way. But I know that a lot of public schools that didn't have online systems set up did not have the same experience. And so looking forward to the fall, I'm really hopeful that schools will develop ways to adapt to this new situation so that kids can keep learning and hopefully families can get the support they need.
Absolutely. And I know this has been extreme outside of the home health, the healthcare workers. I think it's been the hardest on parents because parents have had to juggle family life and also juggle teaching their kids and also, being spouses and husbands and all that kind of stuff. I mean, and all three of those things take a lot of work. So Abigail, I want to talk about the summer because believe it or not, it's hard to believe. We're in June now. It's summertime, and I don't know if there's going to be summer camps. It sounds like there probably will not be summer camps, but I know you have some tips and resources for those listeners out there who are looking to teach their kids maybe in a fun and enjoyable way.
Yeah, definitely. In many places, there won't be those summer camps that we're used to, or even summer school that some kids rely on. And I think a lot of people know that over the summer, students can regress in their learning and can lose some of the learning from the previous school year. And I anticipate that being even more drastic because of the last few months being perhaps not very rigorous for students. So I think it's extra important for parents to try to continue to help their kids learn over the summer wherever possible. At the same time, I think that we shouldn't underestimate that a lot can be accomplished in small chunks of time throughout the day. And so it doesn't have to be an overwhelming task. Like you said, parents are coming off of this experience, probably feeling burnt out and feeling exhausted. And that's a really real thing. And kids are feeling that way too. So I think the most realistic approach is to find a way that works for each family that doesn't feel overwhelming, but can still keep their kids engaged. So one of the main things that you always hear and that really has been shown in studies to be effective is reading for 20 minutes a day and making this a part of the family routine so that students feel that it's a part of their household to be reading for this amount of time each day. It will make them be more engaged and will help them to start the school year next year at their grade level reading, as opposed to perhaps falling back and having to make up later on.
Abigail, when I was in school many, many years ago, many decades ago, I might add, we got a book list. And over the summer, we had to read, Catcher in the Rye, whatever Huck Finn, Tom Sawyer. Is that something that schools still continue to do? And it seems to me, if that's the case, that this would be the perfect time to do that with those 20-minute chunks of time each and every day. Pick up a book, look at the school's book list, and really get engaged and maybe use a different part of your brain instead of looking at the phone all the time.
Exactly. Some schools may offer that. Another great resource is public libraries. They will sometimes have reading lists for students and programs built in for kids to have incentives to read a certain amount of books over the summer and win a prize. So libraries are a great resource for that. Families can kind of develop that too. You can find age-appropriate books online fairly easily, and also following a student's interests can be really important, and finding books that are in an area that they like to learn about can be really engaging. And as always, I encourage parents to make it visual whenever possible. So maybe you have a chart up and you add a sticker every time a book is read, or maybe you have a countdown of the 10 books you're going to read over the summer. Kids need that kind of external visualization of the progress that they're making or the goal that they have in front of them. And that way they can kind of wrap their minds around what they're working towards. And it also makes it feel more valuable for students when they see that visual representation and that everyone in the family is engaged in that. Just like in a classroom where we would all as a classroom be engaged in a certain practice, and we would be showing that in a way that they could see and feel.
Yeah, I used to get gold stars and silver stars when I was a kid. They used to, if I did something right in, middle school, they would do that. And I think you're right. I think people need children. You need kind of a measuring stick, if you will. I think that's so important. I don't have the teaching background, but I just think in terms of accomplishing goals and thinking about how you're going to accomplish goals, that seems to me a very important task, because you don't want this to be like this nebulous deadline or this nebulous goal, right?
Exactly. It's kind of a grounding thing to be able to refer back to. And I think that it would also help to, now that summer's starting, kind of plan out these types of things. What would be a realistic thing to ask your student to do over the summer? Again, that doesn't feel too overwhelming, but that you can all kind of track for the next 6 to 8 weeks before the school year begins again.
And Abigail, we talked about the double duty or the triple duty that a lot of parents have. And while it's important to continue your child's education, it is important to take some time for recreation, I would assume. And I know on our podcast, I was talking with a contributor, and Disney World is opening up. And so that's a perfect opportunity, even though there are some social distancing strategies in place. But it is important to kind of have that balance, right? Even though the school year was truncated in a lot of ways in a lot of school districts, it's important. You don't want to just go all in as a parent and force your child to just read and do schoolwork to make up for that lost time. It's important to have that balance.
Absolutely. And studies have shown that if you do, as we've all experienced, if you're burnt out, that retention and that learning is no longer beneficial to the student. Mm-hmm. At a certain point, it stops being productive. So I think what you're saying is absolutely right. I think that there will be more outdoor physical activities for students to be able to do, maybe not in large groups, but that's always great for development and for learning to balance any kind of reading or math practice that a student may be doing with those physical activities. Another great thing that might apply to a lot of students is finding a coding program to work on over the summer. As we know, students love gaming and they love being on the computer, and it's kind of a way to help students develop a new skill or see their screens differently, mm-hmm. But in a way that can be really engaging, and that might be a little less work on the parent to structure that time because they can begin to build their own games. And from my classroom experience, students are highly engaged in those types of websites. And so that's another way to keep things fun, but also keep kids learning.
Yeah, and you get a skill that obviously is applicable. I mean, we've got kids making web apps or phone apps, I should say, that are revolutionary. Last question, Abigail. Let's talk about teachers, because the school year is not an easy thing. You compress all your work typically in 9-10 months. And then some teachers had their time off during the summer, but we've had a very truncated school year, very compressed school year, put a lot of pressure on teachers as well as parents. What are some tips for, how do you decompress? How do you kind of get your head straight in terms of tackling the next year, the next group of students?
I think that a major thing teachers are reflecting on and thinking about for next school year is how to support our students as people so that we can get back to the learning. And we don't have a lot of answers for next year. Every school district's different. I've heard of a lot of different models that we might be adopting. where we may be back to a physical classroom and then back to online, or online and then back to the physical classroom, or a hybrid model for the rest of the next year.
Yeah.
So education is typically not a quick adapting field, but I think we're going to have to learn ways to support our students. And so that's what I find myself reflecting on a lot, is how are we going to find a way to get students back into learning in a way that's sustainable in these times, and then also just to make them feel safe enough and ready to learn, as well as families feeling that their schools are a safe place that their kids can be. So that's not really how I decompress, but that's the things that have been on my mind and I've been reminiscing about and thinking about for the next couple of months. But I think teachers and families will be needing to monitor their own school district's approach to this situation. It's going to be very different school to school.
Yep.
And over the summer, we'll get a lot more answers, but there's just not many answers right now.
Yeah, I think it's ever evolving, unfortunately, and in so many aspects of this pandemic, it's changing hour to hour, day to day. Abigail, always a pleasure seeing you. Thank you so much for weighing in, and enjoy the rest of your day, and we'll talk to you again very soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Abigail. And when we come back, we'll take a look at our best segments for the week right here on BRN Weekly. Imagine a new television network that will make you richer, healthier, and in control of your financial future. This network is for the policewoman in Nashville, Tennessee, the baker in Dubuque, Iowa, the teacher in Lexington, Kentucky. We want to make the idea of savings and retirement culturally relevant. But what do you see as a defining issue of the midterms? Especially for the smaller businesses. I mean, they are the lifeblood of the American economy. Featuring exclusive interviews, current affairs, and docuseries. 33 years old, you retired early.
The philosophy is money only matters if it helps you live a life that you love.
But you got to start thinking about retirement as soon as you get in.
The Broadcast Retirement Network will drive very high engagement with premium partnerships. So this isn't retirement and savings for your parents or grandparents. This is for all Americans. And we're going to change the way you think about money. Welcome to the next frontier of retirement and savings. This is BRN, the Broadcast Retirement Network.
The windows on our homes, they protect us and the ones we love, but they do much more. At Renewal by Andersen, making your home more comfortable is at the center of every window we make. It's why we custom build our windows in America and install them in as little as 1 day. It's why we build our frames with exclusive Fibrex composite material that's 2 times stronger than vinyl. It's why our glass helps keep your home warmer in winter, cooler in summer, and quieter all year long. It's why we stand behind every window with a 20-year limited warranty. Why not help lower your energy costs while giving your home and family the best? Call 1-800-835-6525 to schedule a free in-home consultation. Buy one, get one at 40% off with this special offer. Plus, get special financing with no money down, no monthly payments, and no interest for 1 full year. Renewal by Andersen, the better way to a better window. Call 1-800-835-6525 now.
Welcome back. On Monday, I sat down with Dr. Michael Drew to learn about how Australia was dealing with the impact of the pandemic. Let's take a look.
Yeah, well, firstly, I just want to acknowledge, I'm sure you do, Jeffrey, the first responders and all the healthcare workers that are doing such an amazing job in our community around the world. So
Absolutely.
Our respect and acknowledgement to them and their service. in Australia, we have taken the virus very seriously. So our government acted very early. We closed our borders early. We've taken social distancing very, very seriously. Even within the states, borders have been closed.
Mm-hmm.
So the response has been actually tremendous from both sides of the political aisle in terms of cooperation. The monetary and fiscal stimulus that's been arranged has been substantial. But the really big thing has been the people of Australia who have taken this very, very seriously. And as such, we've now, as of this morning, have about 7,000 cases and only 102 deaths. Now, I say only, one death is one death too many, but
Sure.
in a global perspective, the lockdown measures have worked particularly well on flattening the curve. I think you're about to ask me what it means for the economic price of that. Obviously, less in terms of actual numbers, but proportionally similar. So the sectors that around the world, hospitality in particular, has been really hit, and small and medium-sized businesses in particular are struggling. So the Australian government, perhaps unlike other governments around the world, our fiscal position was quite sound coming into this, and they've created a 6-month bridge, if you will, to get as much of the economy as possible over the coronavirus ravine. Mm-hmm. So some governments, as you know, are doing sort of 3 months of support. The Australian government have brought in a 6-month package. So at the moment, our financial system is handling it fairly well. We have a liquidity crisis like everyone around the world. I suppose the thing we're watching is whether that morphs into a solvency crisis for household balance sheets. Unlike sort of other crises where you had some sort of build-up in a sector like housing, or banking, or whatever it might be, this time, as you know, this is a demand shock that's affected very different sectors of the economy. So we've had data coming through on the professions being highly impacted this time. Barristers, surgeons. So we've cancelled much of elective surgery in the country to make sure hospitals have been free to treat pandemic cases. But that's been elective surgery has basically been grounded to a halt. It's starting again. But interestingly, this time, we tend to think of savings gaps for those in the lower income stratas, but we're actually seeing this in the higher income strata. So the one that's really caught me a little bit off guard this time is just how basic personal balance sheet thinking is not in much of society. So we've been working with folks not just on, typically you think about financial freedom, but financial resilience has been really shown to be a key weakness for personal balance sheets, regardless of the income level. And I think many academic economists and policymakers, this is a really big insight for the way we think about financial literacy, we think about personal balance sheet and financial resilience. And we tend to sort of go to, our default seems to be for those who are in the lower income levels. Yeah. We're seeing this across the income strata. So I wonder, Jeffrey, if we're not at some point having a conversation about how we think clearly about managing that financial resilience, and perhaps financial freedom is for another day. But that's something that's really shone a light here, is the structural weakness in the way personal balance sheets are formed. And professions that have never been really affected by downturns, as I said, barristers, orthopedic surgeons, pilots. These are, jobs which traditionally have some, resilience to economic cycles, have been shown that the enduring questions of good personal balance sheet management, separating liquidity need from sort of financial freedom. And I think as an advice industry, whether you're working with robo through to family office or, large pension plans, this is the big learning for me on this is liquidity need. We need to really think and help people use that behavioural finance to help them frame risks, and in our lingo, use sort of liability matching techniques. But we need to make that in a human, a non-economist way. It needs to be in a human way, and unfortunately, many people are living this liquidity, and that's perhaps linking back to my earlier comments. The thing that perhaps is keeping me awake at night is when or if, hopefully it doesn't, this turns from a liquidity crisis to a solvency. That's what would make me really nervous. I think it's realistic in the short term until equity markets start delivering double-digit returns again, and those things will all be in the past. Yeah, look, I think you're right, and I think the way we do that is, we've talked a lot about a robo advice. I think now is its time. That helping people solve particular personal balance sheet issues at a very low cost. I think I see that as a really important part of this conversation going forward. And I think at an organisational level, wellness, broadly defined, that includes financial wellness, and all the research shows us that many mental health and other issues are linked to financial stresses. So I think organisations are really going to embrace a more holistic view of wellness, which leads into your area of expertise, which is thinking about the whole personal balance sheet, where the retirement savings fit into that, and thinking through everything from short-term liabilities. So yes, I'm optimistic that now we will see, even if it's done via wellness programs or robo or nudge, that will become more in the mainstream. I think the financial literacy people are about to have their day as well, that there'll be much more emphasis on that going forward. The only other one I'd sort of flag is, and maybe this is a bridge to the second part of our conversation, generating retirement income with forward returns as they are is going to be very, very difficult. So putting my economist hat on, as you know, there's no magic pudding. People have to lower their expectations dramatically, or you get perhaps a negative real rate of return for the next 4 or 5 years. Now, if you have saved hard and really put a big amount of money away, $1 million, $2 million, which is a very large forward-looking returns, particularly if you want that in sort of a risk-free or very low volatile environment, that doesn't translate well into a sustainable retirement income stream.
And on Thursday, I sat down with Delphi Digital co-founder Kevin Kelly to learn about how crypto assets have been faring during this market upheaval. Let's take a look.
Yeah, it's a question we get quite a lot, especially as you've seen the kind of macro space really start to heat up in the amid, what's going on with COVID and the coronavirus outbreak. I would say where we are now is certainly a bit different than where we were even, 2 or 3 months ago. You kind of had this initial really kind of big sell-off phase in risk assets, as we've talked about on your podcast before. And what we've seen now is a pretty sizable rebound in risk, and you're starting to see risk appetite start to come back. And that's actually helped boost, Bitcoin and other crypto assets, because again, they still sit a bit further out the risk curve in terms of this being a nascent technology, an emerging asset class, one could say. So it's certainly given a bit of a boost to digital assets. Where I think we're coming to is a header and inflection point is I think policymakers are certainly faced with kind of this inflection point, right? They can either continue to go by the playbook that they've been running since we really saw, COVID-19, since we saw that outbreak really start to ramp up, especially here in the US. And what that means is basically policymakers, both on the monetary and fiscal side of things, right? So if you're thinking about the US, the Fed and the Treasury are now kind of getting to the final phases, I guess you could say, of their first phase of stimulus and trying to basically keep the economy, the engines running, right? Mm-hmm. And so what I think the inflection point is policymakers can either continue with that current playbook, which means you're probably going to see, another trillion at least in terms of funding, especially for small businesses that continue to struggle, things of that nature. And that'll be monetized by the Fed in this continuation. You either go that route, which certainly has implications for Bitcoin, digital assets and markets in general, or the more fiscally conservative route would be to, maybe wait a little bit longer, see how things play out. But from my perspective, at least, I think that certainly risks a much larger kind of economic downturn, in which case policymakers would have to come back in and provide even more stimulus because the outlook would have gotten even more dire. So I think right now we're in a really interesting position. The long-term implications of a lot of this are certainly, as we've been talking about for a while, this idea of, currency debasement, right? And when we talk about fiat currencies like the dollar, the euro, but a lot of emerging market currencies as well, this idea of currency debasement, I think, is certainly going to be more in the forefront of investors' minds, because when you're thinking of, most people don't think about, the effect that currency fluctuations could have on their portfolios, right? And the U.S. dollar, we're lucky enough to sit, in a country where we obviously have the world's reserve currency, and the dollar has been relatively strong compared to, a number of other foreign currencies. But when you think about the potential implications of dollar-based assets, whether it's stocks, bonds, et cetera, in a world of kind of asset price deflation and currency debasement, it certainly helps bolster kind of the narrative for digital scarcity and assets like Bitcoin, for example. So breaking down what the Fed and again the Treasury are really doing right now. And it's a really important question, because right now, one of the biggest kind of debates in the macro space is whether we see initially these deflationary pressures, which I think everyone at this point expects, which means you're going to see kind of prices fall because you've seen a drop in demand, you've seen oil prices collapse, you're seeing global trade start to contract. A lot of those things can be deflationary, at least in the short term. Inflation is a really interesting and debatable topic, because it's much more of a psychological event than it is a monetary one. And what I mean by that is, just because, let's say money supply or the Fed is printing, trillions of dollars to actually buy these treasuries that are coming to market in order to kind of, again, monetize the government spending, just because that money supply increases doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're going to see a pickup in inflation. It's more about what people's expectations are going forward, and then you can start to see inflation trickle in. What's difficult right now is that it's not like this fiscal stimulus is coming and giving a boost to an economy that maybe is coming out of a recession and can really start to ramp up and spark, greater credit growth, economic growth, things of that nature. What is basically trying to do now with fiscal policy is essentially plug this gaping hole that we've seen not only the U.S. economy, but the global economy, and go after those revenues that the economy would be generating anyway, right? So it's not like it's being put into productive investment or things of that nature, which I think can certainly suppress some of the inflationary pressures you might see from further money printing. Now, what that means longer term for some of these, digital currencies and crypto assets is important to clarify. I mean, Bitcoin itself, yes, you're spot on, has a fixed supply and a fixed inflation schedule, as they like to say, an issuance rate schedule. Ethereum is still, it's not like it has a uncontrolled monetary policy, but that is still being debated in terms of what the longer term kind of predictable inflation schedule is, right? So it's not quite as digitally scarce, I guess you'd say, as something like Bitcoin. But the longer term implications for both of those is, when you see kind of these debt to GDP levels rise, especially in advanced economies, past a certain point, the argument is around 90%, which in the US, we're now approaching 120%. The incremental increase in that debt becomes less and less productive, and it actually can hamper economic growth. So what we're seeing here is there's only a handful of ways in which, advanced economies can get out of these big kind of debt burdens. And one of the most, we think, obvious ones, or one of the most likely, is going to be the government trying to spur greater inflation, greater currency debasement, because that makes the kind of real value of your debts come down over time. And what that does is, again, gives a boost and a big kind of tailwind to this idea of digital scarcity and creating, an asset that actually, is provably scarce versus, the world of kind of fiat abundance that we've really moved into. It's a really interesting conversation to have, because nobody really wants, if you're sitting in government, you don't really want the world to move back towards a gold standard, because again, that'll hinder your ability to be able to have independent monetary policy, and it'll be essentially a check on responsible government policy, right? Which I'm not to say that what's happening right now is irresponsible, but I think, longer term, we're going to see that there's, excessive money pumped into the system. But, when you talk about things like a gold standard or Bitcoin standard, the beauty of Bitcoin and why we think there is still such a kind of asymmetric opportunity here is starting points matter, right? So it's a very small asset compared to even, the investable gold market, for example. It's about, I would say 10 to 15x is the gold market compared to Bitcoin. And what's interesting is that you don't necessarily even need Bitcoin to win the war necessarily to be an incredible, successful investment, right? Even the fact that it's being part of the conversation in the mix of gold, silver, precious metals, crypto assets more broadly, this idea of trying to, again, maintain that purchasing power and find assets that are non-sovereign and sit outside, the financial system, and they aren't tethered to, fiat currencies, is one I think that is the demand for that type of asset is going to continue to increase. And again, Bitcoin doesn't necessarily have to become this global, reserve currency immediately, at least, for, Bitcoin to actually turn out to be a successful investment, in a multi-asset portfolio, for example.
And that wraps up BRN Weekly, but we're not done for the week because tomorrow we have our Sunday podcast where I'm joined by members of the media, academia, and financial services to analyze all the news in retirement, markets, technology, personal finance on the BRN Sunday podcast. You're not going to want to miss it. So until then, I'm Jeff Snyder. Stay safe, keep on saving, and don't forget, roll with the changes.
Attention! The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services has officially authorized new benefits that Medicare Advantage plans may include. To get the benefits you deserve, you can call the Medicare Coverage Helpline.
Hi, I'm Joe Namath. If you're on Medicare, this is important information. I called the Medicare Coverage Helpline and they instantly looked up my coverage. In this one simple call, they offered to enroll me in a plan that includes rides to medical appointments, private home aides, doctors and nurses' visits by telephone, and even home-delivered meals. The plan also includes dental, vision, hearing, and prescription drug coverage, all at no additional cost.
Don't delay. Call to see if the new benefits are available in your area.
Call the number on your screen now. It's free.
Call 1-800-757-1451. That's 1-800-757-1451.